Hello and welcome to EdSurge Live, a talk show about EdTech and the future of higher education. This is our debut episode. Thank you all for joining us. I'm Jeff Young, an editor at EdSurge. Today we're talking artificial intelligence and the increasing presence of algorithms in higher education. It's an important time, I think, to have a dialogue on this topic because there's a lot of unanswered questions. Everything from, there are adaptive learning systems for the classroom. There are advising systems that are trying to use predictive analytics in various ways. But there are also a lot of questions, ethical questions and practical questions and philosophical questions about how far higher education should go in bringing AI and who decides what these systems should look like. To get the conversation started, we're going to start with two guests with different perspectives. Joining us remotely from Stanford University is Candace Thille, who is an assistant professor of education at Stanford's Graduate School of Education. And with me here in studio is Mark Milliron, co-founder and chief learning officer of Civitas Learning. I say studio, we're here at EDUCAUSE annual conference, and there are a lot of panels here I've noticed about AI, but honestly, thank you both for joining us, Mark and Candace.
Sure.
Glad to be in the mix.
Glad to be here.
So I have a couple questions to get things started, and we want to also give time to people in the audience. And I do kind of think of this as like a good NPR talk show where people can call in and ask smart questions, and that's what we hope people out there on video will do, and I know you will. But I wanted to start off. Oh, and we're using this Shindig video platform just to let you know how that works. It lets you ask questions by either video or text. So you're shy, you could do it by text, although I think the video is a great way to sort of to share and let us see you all here virtually. If you want to pose a question, just click the hand icon or the ask a question button on the screen when we get to that part. So Mark, your company develops AI-powered systems for higher education at Civitas, and I wanted to start by getting your kind of big picture vision of the landscape. How would you paint, like as you see it, kind of ideal scenario of how this might play out at colleges and of how a student might be helped in various ways by AI on campus, kind of in an ideal world of the future, of the near future, maybe?
I think it's a great question. It's a broad question. So I think the place higher education writ large is in right now is definitely beginning stages of any kind of use of AI. I would argue that the place we're probably in is kind of moving from accountability analytics to action analytics, where 95% of the data work being done in higher education is really focused on accountability analytics, getting data to accreditors, to legislators, to trustees, to actually tell a story about how the institution has been doing in the past, and talk about students who haven't been there or aren't there anymore, right? So our chief data scientist comes from the world of healthcare, and he basically says that higher ed seems to be obsessed with autopsy analytics, right? It's data about people who are not with us anymore, trying to tell stories to help the current students. I think the shift is we're finally moving from a time of that radical focus on accountability analytics now into more action analytics, where we're actually getting the data and is closer to real time, try to help students. And we're starting to weave in predictive analytics to show trajectories and using those data to try to help current students who are trying to choose better paths, trying to make better choices. They're trying to interact with resources in the right way. And the institution's trying to guide the kind of support they can provide for the student. In particular, they're trying to personalize the pathway the student's going to go on and help shape those big decisions, but also to give them precision support, nudging, encouragement, all at the right kind of time. This is a whole new skill set for higher education because they have not been using the data for this kind of term. And so I think the beginning phases of it has really been a lot of higher education institutions doing the very kind of basic form of what I would almost call algorithmic triggering, where they're saying, based on this demographic category and based on this one assumption, we're going to make sure the student does X, Y, or Z. And that in some ways is painful because sometimes they make assumptions, right? They assume that a demographic category is a proxy for risk, which is in some ways really problematic, and we can unpack that. But I think now we're starting to see more and more of them become more precise and actually understand that student behavior is more predictive, and there are things that students can do to actually engage with the data and actually kind of become captains of their own ship, or at least participate in their own rescue. So long story short, I think we're moving to a time now, and more institutions are beginning to embrace this, where they're trying to use the data to help students in closer real time to improve their learning and expand and increase the likelihood of their completing what they start, which is a significant problem in particular for first generation and low income students. And I think people have realized kind of three big things. One, it's the students' data. It's their data. These are actually, every piece of data is actually a footprint that kind of, if you put it together, tells a story of the journeys these students are on, and their data should be used to help them, right? And right now their data is mostly being used to help the institution justify its existence or tell its own story. And we strongly feel that part of this is getting that data to a place where the institution can use that data to actually help that student. Second thing is it actually turns some pressure on the institution because it gives them kind of, it suddenly becomes a moral imperative of knowing. If you know based on the data that these students are on these trajectories that are great, you want to reinforce them, but other students are on a trajectory where they're probably going to see challenge, you absolutely want to try to intervene in some way and actually help them or inspire them or kind of move them in a different direction. But finally, I think we're seeing a broad embrace in this work. And I think the New America Foundation's privacy document was one of the best talking about this, a real embrace of this notion of do no harm. Is we absolutely have to have a do no harm philosophy with this, where we're using these data to improve the outcomes for students. And this isn't going to be used in a way that's really about just benefiting the institution. It's got to be about trying to help the student.
There's a lot in that answer, and we'll get back to some of those points. Candace, I wanted to ask you, you're an early pioneer of using AI and adaptive learning tools with the online learning initiative that you led at Carnegie Mellon University. But you've also recently raised concerns that when companies offer AI-driven tools, that the software can be a kind of black box that's out of the control of maybe the teachers or educators or those in higher ed institutions. I wonder if you could start by saying a little bit more about that perspective that you've come to.
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Great. So first, hi, Mark. Good to see you again. And I agree with much of what Mark also said. I am a big believer in using the data that we're extracting from student work to benefit and support the students in their learning. So we're highly aligned on that. And I work at a slightly different level than the work that Civitas works on. As Jeff mentioned, the Open Learning Initiative, which I started at Carnegie Mellon and now have also at Stanford, is about using, creating personalized and adaptive learning experiences for students when they're learning a particular subject area. So the way it works is as a student interacts with activities that are mediated by the online environment, we're taking those interactions and running them through a predictive model to be able to make a prediction, in this case, maybe about the learner's knowledge state or where they are on a trajectory for learning the things that they're trying to learn. And this is all very exciting, and it seems very straightforward. And as Mark mentioned, this kind of approach is revolutionizing every other industry. But what we have to recognize is what we're doing is having these systems support our pedagogical decision-making. Because taking a piece of student interaction as evidence, running it through a model to make a prediction about the current state of that learner, and then giving that information either back to the system itself, so the system can make some kind of autonomous decision about how to support that student next. You know, I'll give you this problem next, I'll give you this to read next, or even taking that prediction and giving it to the learner so they can make some decision about what they do next, or give it to a faculty member who's teaching the learner so they can get insight into where the student learning is so they can make a decision about what to do next. All of that is pedagogical decision making. And the data to collect, the factors to include when you're making the model, how to weight the factors, what modeling approaches or algorithms to use, what information to represent once you have the prediction, and how to represent it to the various stakeholder groups, I would say are all very active areas of research and part of the emerging science of learning. So I would argue that in an academic context, all of those parts, and particularly the models and algorithms, can't be locked up in proprietary systems. They must be transparent, they must be peer reviewable, they must be challengeable, so that we can, as we're entering as higher education into this space, the decisions about pedagogical decision making that are being made by folks who know how to make those kinds of decisions. To just say, trust us, our algorithms work, I would argue, as I said before, that that's alchemy, that's not science.
So Mark, as a company in this space, how do you respond to something like that, or how does your company handle these questions?
Yeah, so I think
getting under the hood, right?
Yeah, I think we're in violent agreement about both of this. I think a couple things on this. One is we absolutely think that it is incumbent upon companies like Civitas and organizations who are going to do this kind of work to make sure that we are making transparent what the data science is saying. So one of the things that we've done in particular, so for example, in our tool Illum, if you're looking at any given segment of students and you want to look at their trajectories, one of the first things we do is, even though we have done enormous amounts of modeling and all kinds of work around data availability segmentation and kind of broad-based, kind of diverse modeling based on different student segments, one of the first things we want to do is whatever set of students you're looking at, we actually want to show you the most powerful predictors. So we literally will list the most powerful predictors and their relative score and power in the model, so that people are clear, this is why the trajectory is showing the trajectory it is, so people can understand which variables are impacting it that way. Another example of that is in our tool we have called Aspire for Advisors. We literally have, when they see a projection score for a student, they literally would get the top inspiration factors and the top, we call inspiration and intervention factors. And these are the variables and data elements that are actually driving that student's prediction score. Part of the reason we did that is we wanted the educator to interact with the data, because in many ways what you want is for that educator to be able to make a relevant and clear decision about what's happening with the student. And just to give a concrete example of this, in the very beginning we would see all kinds of advisors, for example, that would look at a prediction score and they would say the student would be a 3.8 GPA, they would have got straight A's last semester, and they will look at a prediction score that says the student is on track to actually not persist. And the advisor would immediately go, there's something terribly wrong with that model. There's no way that's right. So what we started doing is showing the data elements, and they realized, oh, this person has not logged in 2 weeks. They're not interacting with any curricular resources. They haven't followed through on any kind of major deadlines. And so the data elements would pop up, and they would go, oh, there might be something going on. And then they ping the student and find out they lost their financial aid, or a car broke down, and what we found is, and Candace, I'd love to get your take on this, because I think you're right. We're talking about, I think there's pathway analytics and then there's learning analytics in the moment, and we're dealing much more with pathway analytics. Right. And what we've clearly seen, getting the data to people who are managing that, the advisors, the student success people, and letting them iterate on what the challenge actually is, and not assuming we know what the challenge is or even what the response is. But having them iterate with the data is really important. And so part of that is transparency, so they can do it. And then publishing in peer review journals and the rest, so people can see the math. But truthfully, modeling these days is a commodity. That's not the rocket science. What you really want them to understand is which factors you're using and which factors tend to be the most predictive and how they're loading into the model. An algorithm, it's all about correctness and the efficiency of that model. We're trying to make sure that you can maximize those, but really trying to get educators to think this way is a totally different way of thinking for them. I do think we now have emerging communities of practice where people are beginning to share what works and what doesn't work in this. And I think the problem is, to Candace's point, the problem will be the black box. If you do have a black box, the challenge is you have some pretty brutal assumptions in there. And assumptions, in our work in pathway analytics, people will literally use race as a proxy for risk. That's offensive. It's not a proxy for risk for a lot of students. Or they will use, or academic indicators is the only thing that indicates challenge. And what we found is clearly that psychosocial, life and logistics, the Sarah Goldrick-Rab work around, the sustenance living challenges of some of our students are far more pervasive and problematic than the academic challenges. And that's where you get into some much better conversations when people are actually using the data as opposed to the assumptions. That's the challenge of the algorithm, is the assumptions grounded.
And Candace, when you and I were talking just the other day, you were mentioning that, if I understood you correctly, that even this, even agreeing with Mark, you mentioned at some point, people reading this data might take some action that wasn't intended by the people making the software. Is there some concern that students and professors could misuse the data, even if it's designed, even if these other issues you mentioned, like the black box issue is kind of satisfied?
So I think that there are multiple challenges. One of them is, I think people make the assumption a computer is telling me this, so it's neutral, or it's objective, or it's true. And without recognizing that the computer, the algorithm was written by, the system was written by a human being who had certain values, who made certain choices about what factors to include in their model, how to weight those factors, what to use in the prediction or the score that they're giving you. That was a human decision. Or even if you're talking about pure sort of deep learning algorithms where we're not pre-stating what all of those factors are, we're just giving lots and lots and lots and lots of data to the algorithm and say, learn yourself what's important in this pattern. So you could say, okay, that's not then biased by humans, but then it's biased by the data that we give it. So if we don't have extremely representative data that's both representative of large numbers of students in different contexts, but also can be localized to the specific context, then the algorithms are going to produce biased results. And kind of the example I would, and I agree with you completely, Mark, that part of it is making sure that the people who are using the systems really understand what the system is telling them and how to use that. But I'm thinking about institutions, a lot of institutions that I work with that are under a lot of pressure. They're under a lot of pressure for accountability, as you're saying. And a big measure of accountability right now is graduation rates. You know, what's your 4-year or 6-year graduation rate? So a lot of institutions are putting as a measure that we're going to commit to increase our successful student graduation rate from whatever it is now to much higher than that, 4 to 6 year graduation rate. So then you tell all these advisors, and the other thing that's happening is people are being reduced and these systems are being brought in to support the people to make their decision making. So I'm imagining a scenario, which I don't think is too far-fetched, which is, let's say I'm a first generation, I can speak about my cousin, a first generation Latino woman coming into a big open access institution, and I've decided that I want to be a doctor. So I enroll in a pre-med, I enroll in chemistry and biology and all these things in my first year because I want to be pre-med and those are the requirements. I didn't have the privilege of going to some high school that gave me lots of practice thinking about science and math and so on, the way that this institution is expecting me to. But I come in, I'm first generation. I'm also trying to deal with that I don't have a lot of knowledge about how college even works. And I'm probably feeling a little bit like, do I really belong here? I'm excited that I got in, but I'm kind of questioning my fit here. So I take my first year and I take the biology sequence, I take the chemistry sequence, and then say for my elective, I take a Latina studies class because I'm interested in that. And I get C's and D's in my biology and chemistry courses, and I ace my Latina studies class.
I think I wanted to actually, we're going to get Candace back online in a second. Thanks for everybody but I actually wanted to bring in another guest into the conversation and who deals with this from yet another perspective. Kyle Bowen.
Candace is back.
Oh, Candace is back. Kyle Bowen.
Did I cut out?
Yeah.
Did I cut out?
Yeah, I would let her finish.
Please finish, Candace. You were on a roll. I'm sorry we lost you there for a second.
Okay, I'm sorry, that's a connection. So I don't know where we left our hero. Our student coming in of just having gotten poor grades, C's and D's in biology and chemistry, acing her Latina studies class, coming in to meet with her advisor, who looks at the predictive analytics and says the chances that this student staying in a chemistry major is going to graduate in 4 to 6 years is maybe 2%. Whatever the algorithm was used. It's just saying, and I can look at the back end data. It shows me the reason we're making that prediction is you did really poorly in chemistry and biology, and students who do that, and you came from a high school that didn't prepare you well. You know, you're working outside of class to try and support yourself. You know, it just isn't looking like a picture of success for you to stay in this major, but you've done really well in your Latina studies class. And so we would predict that if you switched majors to Latina studies, you would definitely graduate in 4 years and you'll have a much better time here at our college. So I, in all hope to try and get you student success, I'm going to recommend you switch majors. Now I think about if it was one of my kids sitting in that chair, that student chair, their response would be, that's your belief. I know I'm going to be a doctor. So you figure out how this institution's going to help me be a doctor. And they wouldn't change majors. My concern is for a student who is already in a position where they're thinking, these authorities are here to take care of me. They have my best interest at heart. I can see they're showing me the data. It doesn't look like I'm going to be a success. I was kind of nervous about it anyway. It was really hard. I guess they're right. I'll switch majors. And my concern is not just the loss for that individual learner, I mean, that's a loss, but also the loss for us as a larger society about what an amazing doctor that young woman may have been. But because of looking at patterns that are all built on historical data, say, to meet this outcome, it's better if you switch majors. That's my big concern about how these kind of pathway data are going to be used. So.
Boy, I could not agree more on that issue. Am I on? Yeah, I could not agree more about that issue. And I think the challenge for the educators who want to use this data is, one, is I think if it's used incorrectly, it ends up being for the benefit of the institution, not for the benefit of the student. And that's really problematic because the institution will do things like try to get students out of STEM pathways into different kinds of pathways they think will be more successful on. The question is, can we take the same data and use them in a radically different way or a much more effective way, which is to say, use our design thinking and say to that student, okay, a student like you at this stage, if you really want to be successful in this pathway, here's what we've learned about students like you who have been successful. If you can pass this course at this level and you can take advantage of these resources, you can double your likelihood of graduating within the next 4 to 6 years. And you can start almost teaching them how to level up, where you say, and give them milestones they can reach. That suddenly gives you another way to engage them, and that might not be the best way. There might be other ways to engage them, but the idea is iterating in a way to help them achieve whatever that goal is. But I could not be more in agreement with you about the idea that the facile answer to a lot of people's use of data is to use data to optimize the kind of general outcomes they're going for, as opposed to look at this in a more complex way. And I have the exact same fear you have. And I think one of the reasons why we have to have this community of practice and have people really challenge each other on this, and again, the do no harm strategy, is it has to be at the core of this, because the harm is you are making brutal assumptions about that student's likelihood to be successful, and you're also basing it on correlation causation data, which is just deadly, right? So part of this is, can we get better than that faster? The good news is we're in the very early stages of this, and if we can develop kind of a norm and an ethic around this, we can make sure good stuff happens more likely than not on the road ahead. But I do think it is going to be a community of practice that's going to have to hold itself accountable, much like in healthcare, right? The idea in healthcare, the same kind of things in healthcare.
So I want to
I just kind of say one little quick thing there, Jeff. Because what I was hoping you were going to say, Mark, I mean, I agree with what you said. And I was hoping you were going to say the other way we can use this data is not just to try and fix the student, but use the data to look at what are the patterns telling us. If students with this profile are failing out of introductory chemistry, then it's not just how do we get that student to be different. It's what do we need to look at? If we're seeing that as a generalizable pattern, then what do we need to look at the way we're teaching introductory chemistry to make it so that not so many students are failing out of it? So that would be the other way of using that data.
I want to give you a complete concrete example of that. So we have this tool called Courses that looks at the predictive power of courses on trajectories. And so, for example, you often see that the DFW courses are not the courses that are most predictive. They're often courses that most students pass. But if they get, for example, just give a clear example of a student, for example, an accounting major at one university, their English 102 grade is hugely predictive. If they get an A or a B, they're very likely to be fine in that program. But if they get a C in English 102, they still pass it. They literally have a 40-point difference in their likelihood to graduate. And then that's when educators have to engage that data. And one of the things, there's a bunch of things they can do with that data. One is they might have accounting majors who aren't taking English seriously because they don't realize how important it is. So you can nudge them before they take the course to make sure they take it seriously. Two, they could analyze the curriculum and realize what they did find out is there was all these case studies at the end of the junior year and the senior year the students had to prepare and actually produce, and there was not much writing from the English 102 until then. And so it was a real call for, okay, we have to start doing some writing across the curriculum and get that student, because if they only learn, really kind of master writing in that first year and they don't touch it again really until the end of the junior year, that's a different conversation. That's a writing across the curriculum conversation. Or it could be the design of that course is not right for that student and or for that major. So maybe you need to have writing in the accounting context or whatever it's going to be. there are literally 5, 10, 15 things you could do based on the data, but that means we have to iterate and actually kind of process that data, not just say, okay, this student needs to get out of that major. And that seems to be the facile answer right now.
I want to, this is so much stuff, I knew the time would fly. I want to jump in and introduce Kyle Bowen, who joined us here a minute ago, but we haven't gotten to introduce him yet. He's kind of, this is another perspective I think is an important one in this discussion. He's the Educational Technology Services Director at Penn State University. Thanks for being here. I wonder, I know you've thought a lot about AI-driven software and tools, and I wonder, this is obviously, these are bigger, different conversations than you might have had back when it was a tool for, doing a clicker audience response system or something. This is a very different set of questions. So from your seat, how does it change things when you're looking at tools that might involve AI, if you're building them or buying them or whatever or partnering with or whatever you want to call it? How is the choice different for you and how do you see it?
Sure. So I think there's a couple of things to look at here. And part of it is to, one is it's important for institutions to begin to develop these kinds of capabilities, right? So this type of, and a lot of that starts with creating a an ecosystem for data at your university. So being able to access this data, understand where it's coming from and what the actual data elements mean. And because with that, then you can more effectively work with partners in the industry, with your own internal researchers, with software developers inside the institution to begin to explore some of the applications using this kind of technology. But the interesting part is what we're seeing is really kind of a separation of ideas in here, which is one, looking at kind of the use of data to help drive pathways, which is what we've been kind of talking about a lot as I've watched this afternoon. But then there's another aspect to this, which is looking at the ways that these tools can help kind of take on other challenges that universities often face. So this is one area where we're spending a lot of time and effort researching how can AI and machine learning be used to help drive the design development of open educational material. How can these kinds of technologies be used to help our students have deeper conversations online? How can we use these kinds of technologies to take on problems that really seemed too complex? And so this is a great area. And so part of it is having that data ecosystem, having a good foundation to work from. And at Penn State, this is an area where we're bringing together faculty from across the university. So these aren't just computer science faculty, but really they come from engineering, from health, from technology, from in education, coming together, thinking critically about how do we apply this to solve other big problems that face education. And I think that, so when we talk about the uses of AI and machine learning in this space, that's the green field, right? That's the area where I think we can go out and begin to experiment. But at the same time, that's on a much longer trajectory, right? So we are just beginning to understand the implications of that and the some of the complex legal issues that surround something like that. So we've worked with projects that have algorithms that are expressive, so they can express new content. So when a machine expresses new content, then who's the author? So it raises these questions that we've never faced before, and so in many ways, it's a discussion that almost seems science fiction at times. And so that's part of the exciting part of this, which is kind of beginning to explore not only the ways that we can use data to help our students be more successful, when it comes to the moment of learning.
So I want to open this up to the folks here in the audience, and for any of the three of our guests here, how does it? I guess so. You, as I mentioned before, you can ask a question by video by pressing the hand icon, or if you want to press the ask a question icon to ask in text. I think we had a couple questions come in by text. Here's one. What use cases do you think AI will impact first or most? Do you think the non-academic use cases or with academic use cases like Newton? Which will be first and why? Candace, I think I saw you nodding. Do you have an answer to this one?
Yeah, I actually think that I'm getting an echo.
Oh, sorry, but we can hear you.
Okay. There, that's better. So I think that I don't know which one's going to have an impact first. I think they're going to happen simultaneously. The one, of course, that I pay most attention to, and like our conversation here, is in the academic arena. How are these technologies going to be used to actually support the teaching and learning process? And I would actually think the Jill Watson example is also an example of that. Jill Watson is, for people who know, in the Georgia Tech, they're using Jill Watson as an AI TA. So that is still serving in a pedagogical agent kind of way. And so with Newton, that is this notion of personalized and adaptive instruction and so what Newton does, and what any personalized and adaptive technology does, is you design tasks for students to do in the interface. As the students and this is what OLI does too, as students interact with those tasks, every interaction is a piece of evidence that then gets put through a model. And I would disagree with you, Mark, that the models don't matter. We've seen very different predictions come out of different ways. And maybe you were saying at the pathway model, it doesn't matter. In the predicting knowledge state, it matters what models you're using to make the predictions and how you're weighting the models and what factors you're including and all of those things. So what happens is all of those interactions are pieces of evidence that then get put through some kind of modeling algorithm to produce a prediction that then is either given back to the system to make a decision, which is what I think Newton claims to do, that the system itself will autonomously decide what activity to give a student next, or to give it to an instructor or to a student so they can make a decision. My challenge there is that given that we know from learning research that to differentiate instruction, the way you would differentiate instruction is very complex. The factors that you need to consider are very complex. Then I would argue that the algorithms or the state of our science isn't that yet there to be able to make a really good prediction that you could just autonomously let a system make that decision. And I still think figuring out the gold here is going to be figuring out which of those decisions we give to humans to make, which we can let a system autonomously make. That sort of human in the loop AI is, I think, where we should be focusing our next research area.
Truthfully, that's why I love Candace's work, because Candace, actually that interaction between what the machine can do well and what the person can do well is a ripe area for learning. And I probably inartfully said the models don't matter. What I meant is the models are commoditized, and that the modeling is not magic. It's out there, and you just need to examine which modeling technique you're using for which purpose, and you can actually look at the outcomes to see how it works.
Are you saying it's not a trade secret, in other words? Is that what you meant? Or?
I'm just saying that modeling is less and less of a trade secret. There's more modeling. The modeling is out there in terms of how most people are using basic frames of basic kinds of models, and you can actually track the model use. It's which model did they apply and how did they apply it, what data was used to it, and then what algorithmic decision frameworks were put in place to be able to kind of drive the model. And Candace is right, that's got to be transparent. The good news is, I would argue, we're already starting to see outcomes out of this, right? So it's weak AI, but we're already seeing people using predictive models to actually inform precision outreach to students. So for example, we have predictive models that show students who are high GPA but have a high likelihood of not persisting, and we're designing outreach that is based on mindset. So we're doing outreach that are basically, congratulating them for their success, but then saying, but we understand students like you often have challenges with transportation, with housing, with work-life balance. If you're experiencing any of these, make sure you reach out to us. We're ready to have a conversation with you. And those little mindset nudges at the right moment that are triggered by AI, we're seeing double-digit gains in terms of the retention of those students. So we're seeing, and I think that's the closed loop part of this, is we're starting to see the outcome measures that are helping us understand the impact of how these decisions are made and how people are using these techniques. So I think we're starting to see the beginning phases of outcomes in this. It's clearly, like I said, weak AI in the first phases of it, but I think as we learn together how to do it, we're going to get more and more interesting use cases. And more importantly, we're going to develop kind of a scholarship of how this works. I do think, Candace, that we have to really make sure we are figuring out how we connect the dots between discrete learning experiences and learning pathways, because I actually think there are magic moments in the classroom that inspire students on pathways, and then there are pathways that actually bring somebody to the right learning moment, and then there are probably even co-curricular kind of experiences that you could make sure you weave together for students. So part of this is one of my biggest things, and I'd love to get all your take on this, is this notion of making sure we're thinking about using this as almost an optimization question, which is how do we help students make the most of that educational experience, have access to the best learning outcomes, and kind of the possibilities of having the right internship or the meeting the right people, having the connections. I think that's really interesting.
And I would echo that. And I think that's a real opportunity. And so a lot of work, to this point has focused on, how do we identify at-risk students and intervene before they have challenges, right? Yeah. And I think that's important and that's critical work. But at the same time, there's also an opportunity to raise ceilings. So how do we identify students who aren't living to their potential and could be? And what more can we do in those kinds of spaces? And I think there's a great opportunity there. But to circle back to something Candace was saying, I think it was a really important part of understanding work in this area is that it is people and machines working together, right? So it's not, so when we talk about AI, we imagine robots, we imagine science fiction, we imagine, Skynet overthrowing the world, right? These are the things that we imagine. But the reality is it's not nearly that sexy, right? It's not nearly something that Michael Bay is going to make a film out of. That the reality is that some of the really interesting applications of this are people and computers working together to think about, or to explore different problems or ideas. And so, the examples I like to use are thinking about, the word suggestions you get when you text message. It is going to try and fill in the text message, and you always get goofy stuff, right? And so that doesn't always work the way you want it to. Or thinking about the way that Netflix provides recommendations to you based on TV and film to watch. And so this type of way of thinking about kind of people working together with the software changes the dynamic and also opens up new opportunities to think about its teaching and learning application. I want to touch on one example really quick. So one area of research we're engaged in right now is looking at the development of assessments around particular materials. So anybody who's ever had to write a midterm or final and actually generate a set of kind of assessment questions with multiple choice answers and distractors knows the pain that can be, and to make sure that you're actually covering all the material and hitting all the great points and these kinds of things. It takes a lot of time and effort. And so we're working on approaches to help, based on a body of work, to extract from that the assessment questions, the ideas and the distractors that would come along with those. And one of the interesting things we've learned from that is that, well, one, the development of a distractor comes from an area called adversarial learning, which deals with this idea of trying to make something look as real as possible without it actually being real. So if you think, that's what a distractor is. But then it turns out that computers are really good at that. They're really good at exploiting,
distracting people.
At distracting, exactly. And so in our initial kind of research, what we've discovered is these tests are really hard. I mean, because as they get generated, they don't show the same kinds of mercy that a human would. And so why in this case, the idea isn't that an algorithm would read the material and just automatically generate an assessment and give it to the student, but rather it's more a way to inform the instructor about kind of the design of their assessment. And so to make sure that these are people that kind of working together to explore some of these areas.
So I want to get to a couple more questions because they're rolling straight.
Candace want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. Candace.
Well, while we're getting another question, I just wanted to say another way of using AI and humans together on that point of constructing assessments is, say, in my open statistics course, I have hundreds of faculty all over the country that are using that courseware as an open educational resource. And so if they want to put a question in that they like, we want to be able to give them feedback on how well that question performed, not only for their students, but for the thousands of students that are using the courseware. So that's another way, we haven't done this yet, but we're about to turn the switch on, to use the adaptive problem solver technology that learns about a learner to adaptively deliver a question, to also learn about the questions, to give the instructors information back about this is how your question performed for these learners in these conditions. And so you can decide, do I want to modify that? So we're not only trying to help the learners get better at statistics, but also the statistics faculty get better at writing.
TA was the same quality as autocorrect. That would be, yeah. So there's all different visions of the AI that we have already in our lives and of different qualities. And I think these are all really interesting about how that feedback will be used and how it will change. We do have some more questions. There's a one from Mark Corbett-Wilson. Where are student leaders and student governments in the design and selection of AI tools? Where's the student voice in this?
No, I think that's a great question. We actually began the development of our degree map tool with a 300-hour ethnography. of students and advisors. And Laura Malcolm, who's my co-founder at Civitas, along with Charles Thornburg, Laura comes out of a design school at Stanford, and her mindset was all about getting to empathy first. And so getting that student voice became a really important part of this larger process. And what we found in all of our projects and products that we put together is beginning with that sense of empathy matters. So bringing student voice in and getting them to be a part of what do you really need to help you kind of frame this decision and how are you going to interact with it. And I think a lot of this work, what really concerns us is it ends up being what are we going to do to students as opposed to working with the students to have them be a part of co-design in terms of what this is going to look like. And part of the reason we did that, and I'll just be blunt about this, and Jeff, you and I have talked about this before, is I think larger higher education is an insider trading game. And what I mean by that is I think higher education tends to be successfully navigated by people who are second, third, fourth, fifth generation students who come from higher income families. And part of the reason is because they're scaffolded by human system algorithms, parents. All right, parents who have all kinds of information that can give them advice about how they navigate systems, and it's parents and friends and family. First generation low income students tend not to have the same kind of support. So part of the reason we wanted to design the systems we designed, like Degree Map or College Scheduler, was we wanted to bring to that student the same kind of scaffold and advice that would help them get on a good track, stay on a good track, and complete that they would get if they were around. And leveraging the data from highly successful students to do that. And when you get the reaction from students when they see this, where was that when I was going to school? That's when you know you've designed something the right way, right? Where they're like, oh my Lord, where was this? When you can give them a tool that says, here's the right set of courses to take next, or here's the trajectory you want to get on, or here's how you put your schedule together to be able to fit into your complicated life. That's, again, you're meeting the student where they are. And so that's where we've tried to involve the students is from the very beginning in empathy and understanding, but also in the design of the products. And then you measure the outcomes to see what other kind of things they'd like to see.
Kyle, what do you think about that? Are there ways in which you're looking for student voice at Penn State?
Absolutely, and to provide you with a direct example. So over the last couple of years, we've been exploring this notion we call the robot writer, which is the idea that could we get to a state where, given a table of contents and a set of iterations by an instructor, that we could get to an algorithmically generated textbook that would displace a very expensive textbook in the classroom. And in the first pilot of something like that, we actually did. We displaced the traditional textbook, replaced it with an open alternative that was where the professor for the class iterated and designed that with the help of an algorithm that would understand what do you mean by these certain topic areas, and read that from an open content repository and helped distill down a custom text. But then as part of that class, then we also put that same tool in the hands of all of the students and said, create your own textbook for this class. Because it was a general education course, it was on a technology topic, and many of the students came from different backgrounds, different disciplines, different majors. What we wanted to see was how do they take this and make it relevant to their own learning. And it was an interesting process because what happened as a result was that they expanded far beyond the intent of the class in terms of the scope of the content, right? That they engaged in what we kind of jokingly refer to as feral reading, right? It was just that they kind of, as they dug deeper into the content, they were beginning to uncover more and more. And that's been an interesting byproduct of that kind of discussion is the fact that we can not only use these tools to help inform or support our faculty, but then we can also use them as teaching tools themselves. And so in that particular case, that was one of the ways we got feedback was to put the tools directly in the hands of the students and to begin to, so that when we began to ask them questions about, ask students questions about thinking about the credibility of a text that's been, supported or generated by a machine, like how do you think about that? They have the context and understand, oh, well, I've done that. I know what this is about, and I know how I can feel about that.
So I think we're going to bring someone up on stage on stage in the video here to ask a question. Give me a second. So Michael Sano of EdSurge is I think he has a question from Twitter, if I'm not mistaken. Hey, Michael.
Hi everybody. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
All right, cool. I've got a question here from Dave McCool on Twitter. It's directed at Candace, but I think open to everyone. And the question is, are our algorithms good enough yet that we can automate personalized learning?
So are our algorithms? So I guess the answer is no. But it's not just about the algorithms. It's about, so in order for the algorithms to truly be able to personalize and adapt learning, I would say we need our science of learning to be more robust. So, and what I mean by that is when you're trying to make a decision to differentiate instruction to support a particular learner, there's information you need about the learner, about the knowledge you're trying to support that learner to develop, and then about the context in which the learner is learning. And the features of each of those three different entities and how those features interact to be able to support a decision about at this point in time, what would be best to do for that learner, that's what the science of learning needs to build. And right now we have very rough variables that we use, like about the learner. Most of what we know is their demographic factors, which may or may not be material. We might know something about their knowledge state or their current skill state. But we need to know also about the knowledge that we're trying to develop. How does that interact with their current skill state? And then how does that interact in the context? Like, are they in a context in which their particular identity is stereotyped? And so the kind of instructional intervention you might do for one learner with one particular constellation of features, learning one particular piece of knowledge with this constellation of knowledge in a particular context might be very different than what you would even do for that same learner in a different context, learning something different. So I think I chose to expand the question. It's not just about the algorithms. It's about all of the things that we need to know for those algorithms to perform well. And the algorithms themselves, we're always coming up with new algorithmic approaches. And that's why I say this is current active research and needs to be taken on as such by higher education.
Community of practice of this really matters. And that's why we invested so much in working to develop our impact tool, because it allows people to understand the impact of what they're doing in a way where they can start engaging in the science in a more concrete way, and they could share with each other and develop a community of practice around this. Because exactly to Candace's point, if a student is actually has a mindset challenge where they're suffering from the imposter syndrome, right, where they think someone's going to figure out they don't belong there, that's a different question whether or not they're wrestling with a specific algebraic concept, right? Or if a person, truthfully, and again, pathway data, this student actually lost their financial aid and now they're homeless, right? That student is in that learning moment is wrestling with something very different than what that learning specific challenge is. So that's where, we have a lot to learn about how the interaction of who that student is, how they come to the class, how they come to that learning moment, together with what the right pedagogical tool is going to be. This is so much art and science that anybody who says they have it all figured out, you should run from right now.
And Michael, thank you for bringing us this question from Twitter. That's great. And I actually am curious, Mark. Right now I feel like we're in a moment where some of this, I feel like there's an appetite usually for like the exciting futuristic predictions, except for right now we're living in this time where there's this disillusionment, I think, widespread disillusionment about some of the tools we already have, like whether it's Facebook and all the questions right now about fake news and manipulation potentially by various sources manipulating these platforms. And some of this is back to algorithms in the non-educational setting. I guess, is there a part where, is there something you think AI in education should not be applied to? And are you, how much do you worry about a dark history coming, or a dark future coming, even though you have good intentions and you have these plans that you're setting forward? How much do you worry about that? And is there an area that you think should not be AI applied in education?
I would have to think about that one for a little while. I think, as a general rule, I think to think about it in terms of enablement and not enforcement. And I think anytime you're using data to enforce something, that's just the wrong way of approaching it. I'd have to consider for a moment what pockets of teaching and learning that may not be appropriate in. But I think the essential piece of it is that we continue to have it be a technology that enables students, enables faculty, enables advisors, and it's about enabling people. And in many ways, this data is human driven, and so so those are the key aspects of it. But that's what I'm going to be thinking about now So next year, it's a date. We're going to talk about all the places where AI shouldn't be used, but I'm sure they're there.
And Mark, what about you?
So I think you can go dark quickly on this and think about all the ways that these tools can be misused. And I am deeply concerned. In fact, Charles Thornburg, my co-founder, and I often talk about the fact there are some people who should never, ever, ever, ever use analytics or AI, just because I think they're going to use it for selfish purposes, or they're going to use it in ways to manipulate students. And we've seen that already. You know, that horrible kill the bunnies moment, right, where somebody's using it for admissions processes and others. That being said, I think if the academic community can come together, I think if the education community can come together around this learning science in a way where we can turn that lens on how we use the best of these data to help these students. I think one, I've said it before, it's the idea that these are the students' data should be used to help the student, right? And I think there is a moral imperative of knowing. If we can do this work and understand the student has the opportunity to be engaged at a higher level or to be helped at a certain time, we have an obligation to do something to help that student and try to figure out how to help that student. And above all, I do think there's this ethic of do no harm. How do we make sure whatever we do is about optimizing that student journey? I do think a couple things really bother me. I think we have a reductionistic view where this is all about at risk. And I think that is very limiting. I think we should be actually taking our aperture back and thinking about how we optimize education outcomes for all students. We've seen, for example, at USF, where they have, they suddenly had significant jumps in their retention and success rates, and they've closed their equity gaps, and they've done it without a focus on demographic categories. They've done it with a focus on data of optimization, which has been kind of great. But I think we have to get rid of that reductionistic, only at risk view. And I think to flip it to the positive, I think if we do this right, Jeff, I think we have the opportunity to enter, and I'm not being hyperbolic about this, I actually think it's true, we have the opportunity to enter kind of a golden age of learning, where we have more tools at our fingertips than ever before to understand what's working and what's not for which student, and help those students, and especially, and I can't reinforce this enough, especially for low-income first-generation students, many of whom do not have the human system algorithmic engines that our parents and friends that can help them in ways that other first-generation students don't have. We can get that same kind of support and even the playing field for a lot of folks who I think been left behind in a lot of this educational innovation.
That's an interesting frame. And I want to make sure we're running low on time, which is.
I want to hear Candace's response to that.
Come on. Okay, Candace, we'll let you weigh in on this too, Candace. Is there something we shouldn't be using AI for at all? Education?
Well, I guess there's not something I don't think we should use. I don't think we should misuse it. I mean, I think it presents an amazing opportunity for higher education, which is higher education institutions have three core missions that they're supposed to have: a research for creating new knowledge, the research mission, the mission for disseminating knowledge, the teaching mission, and then the community service mission. And what this technology provides us the opportunity to do is bring those three missions together much more tightly than they ever have. I mean, for most institutions, those three missions have gotten really siloed. And so now in many institutions, we have the situation where the researchers, like myself, are doing all of this research into understanding human learning. We publish it in our journals, we throw it over the wall, we hope the practitioners pick that up and use that in some way to inform their teaching practice. But often they don't, and often when they try, it doesn't work because our research didn't cover the complexity of the context in which they were really teaching. So we have this really dysfunctional linear technology transfer model from research into practice. And our industry, if you think of higher education as an industry, is one of the few industries that is in a privileged position to not have to put up with that. You know, because our researchers, our practitioners, and the people that are supposed to benefit from the research and practice are all co-located, both temporally, geographically, and most importantly, under mission, which is the mission that Mark is talking about. So we can break this linear technology transfer model and have researchers and practitioners and learners co-creating the interventions and learning from them so that we're both supporting student success and building our fundamental understanding of human learning simultaneously. And that's what I think the technology and the AI models could be used for. But to do that, we have to be willing to not only use the patterns to look at the students, but also use the patterns to look at ourselves.
So I want to see if we can do at least one more question here. I know there's some out there, so thanks for bearing with us out there. So a question from Paul. What about after the higher ed experience? Lifelong learning will be inevitable for many folks and because of innovation change. Do you feel that AI experience should be seamless?
I could not agree. I think that is such a great question. And I think we have been using the idea of analytics to help people understand how they're getting to higher education, get through higher education, and then helping them understand how they're going to stay connected to learning for the rest of their life. I think you are going to see kind of intelligent education connections. And you're already seeing, and there's a reason why Microsoft bought LinkedIn, and one of the reasons is Linda, is this idea of this kind of long-term, lifelong learning. But I think you're going to see lots of educational institutions try to create this lifelong relationship for learning enterprise with their folks. And what's exciting about that is the idea of being able to stay connected to a system that understands your learning needs as you need them. What's interesting is that anybody who has an 8, 9, and 10-year-old is watching this in practice, right? As their kids use YouTube and whatever else it is to learn whatever they want in the moment. And they're going to be very comfortable with that because they're used to being able to search out. Right now, they're using kind of a pull technique where they're searching out and pulling it in. You're going to see much more of a push technique in the future. But I think it's going to become much more expected, and you're probably going to have learning concierges, right, that are kind of serving people over time. And at one point, it might be a university you're working with, at another time, it might be Linda, at another time, it might be a friend down the street in a makerspace. And other times, it might just be giving you open education resources that are curated and by the right kind of community. And I think it's going to be really rowdy and interesting as that kind of comes to forth.
Yeah, I think the learning concierge is going to be an AI agent, actually.
Yeah, and I think we also look at kind of the way that information can flow back into the design of programs, the design of courses, and so on, based on as we have graduates beginning to interact as part of their jobs, interacting with each other and learning further. To what degree does that inform the definition of the experience itself? So it creates this really symbiotic relationship, I think, between the two going forward. But then at the same time, it also begins to open interesting business models. We begin to think about what is lifelong learning going forward. How far are we from a subscription model for education to a Netflix-like thing where, well, I just continue to learn as I have my monthly fee. These types of things. So we're seeing these things play out in small ways, but at the same time, all there really needs to be is that kind of underlying stream of data to begin to draw these things together. And so I think in going forward, this is a really interesting data problem, right? To think about, okay, what are those data points? How do we get access to them? How do we bring them together? Because as we've looked at kind of teaching and learning, we started off by having ambient data. We had so many of the things we were doing were driven by things that were already in our databases, that we were already collecting as part of admissions, these kinds of things. So now we're looking at what does this look like when they begin to exist in a disaggregate form? And how do we begin to bring that together and develop a new insight? And
I don't want to gloss over, and Candace talked about this at the beginning, the challenge of, we have real challenges of data in. What kind of data people are going to be using. And we have a heavy reliance, for example, a couple things, heavy reliance on demographic data, using demographic signals, proxies for risk and other things. But we also have biases towards the kinds of students we care about. So for the longest time, iPads would only focus on first-time, full-time students. And so all the analytic models were focused on FTIC students. And it was such brutal, it was brutal for part-time students and working students where they would just be neglected completely. And only just the last few weeks that they kind of make that change. And I'm going to be very interested to see now that we're suddenly seeing reporting regimes change, whether or not the algorithms change. Because now suddenly transfer students count. Wow, so we're going to see whether or not that is a big deal. And I think that's where we can focus on what's the data, what's the reporting requirements, and then aggressively looking at the algorithms, because a lot of the basic algorithms are based on assumptions that come from humans about the way they think it works, as opposed to looking at the actual data and trying to tune it in real time.
Well, we're out of time, but I wanted to, we could obviously go on here, and I really appreciate everyone out in the audience. I'm sorry if there were questions we didn't get to, but this has been great. I mean, I think that you see that this conversation, I think it is timely to have this, and it's not over by any means. And so we hope to keep, we'll be covering this at EdSurge and continue this dialogue. Thanks everybody for joining us. This is the first EdSurge Live, and we're going to do this again. It's a series of conversations on different topics. The next one is going to be on Tuesday, January 16th. We're going to take a little bit of delay for the holidays and let everyone have their holidays. But January 16th, we're going to do this again at 3:30 Eastern again, and we'll have a different guests, different topics, and a different topic, and we'll look forward to seeing you there. We'll put out more information. Again, thanks to our guests, Candace and Mark and Kyle for joining us. We really appreciate your perspectives.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Candace.